Well, dear colleagues and dear friends, firstly, I would like to offer my sincerest thanks to Mr. Gissurarson for having organized this conference and given me the honor to give the opening presentation. I would like also to apologize for my poor English pronunciation. I am sure will irritate the ears of those of you who studied at Oxford. Well, as all of you know, 20th century communism has its origins in European culture and developed from three principal sources. First, the idea of utopia, as presented by Thomas More in 1516, is utopia presented the perfect society as being non-corrupted by individual property rights and wealth. But Thomas More was not a communist, only a Catholic. Second, the idea of a political and social radical revolution was propagated by the French Revolution, especially during the Jacobin phase from 1792 to 1794. This viewpoint was characterized by dictatorship and terror. It went as far as to justify the mass extermination of the enemies of the people. Not only individuals, but a whole population, as for instance in Vendée, in the west of France, where was a real genocide in 1793 and 1794. Let me remind you that a number of Bolsheviks before 1917 and during the 20s called themselves proletarian Jacobins. So there was a strong connection. Third, finally, the Marxist ideology of the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848 considered history as class struggle and announced, citation of the Manifesto, the violent overthrow of all previous social orders. However, one has to wait until 1902 and 1903 before a Russian, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, famous Lenin, inspired by Sergei Nechayev's famous text, Catechism of the Revolutionary, published a synthesis of these three sources. It was from this synthesis that Lenin built the Professional Revolutionaries Party. This party would be directed by a unique ideology and by a single charismatic leader. So this kind of party was completely different of the parties which were growing in the democratic countries at that time. Lenin successfully seized power in November 1917 through this political machine while waiting for the favorable moment to strike. He founded the new totalitarian political regime that was characterized by embedding the following monopolies from 1970s until 1922-23, when he was sick. So first, most important, the political monopoly. The regime was radically opposed to all democratic representation. It upheld the concept of a permanent national and international civil war. It instituted that it termed the proletarian dictatorship. The single political party was organized as the unique state party. In this way, it could seize and control the totality of the state's institutions, all decision-making organizations such as political, economic, cultural, etc., as well as the totality of the public administration. Second monopoly, economic monopoly. The state party seized all national resources, land, mines, housing, etc., etc., as well as controlling the production and distribution of all material goods. Third, the intellectual monopoly. The single-party state imposed a unique revolutionary ideology that became and consecrated orthodoxy under the Marxist-Leninist doctrine. This doctrine was imposed on all eras of human intellectual activity: press, media, education, research, cinema, etc. 4. The state terror monopoly. Finally, the most important power monopoly was that of state terror. The regime maintained itself by using mass terror and the systematic extermination of the people enemies, real or invented. This was done by its secret police and the state army that were mobilized in a state of permanent national and international civil war. Lenin, in addition, wanted to extend this regime and revolutionary movement to the whole world. He established the Communist International, or Comintern, a central organization that would aid the emerging communist parties in Europe and elsewhere in the world and support all subversion, even with weapons, for instance, in Iceland, for instance, in France. In 1922, Lenin appointed Stalin as General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party and then as his successor at the head of the party. Stalin was an old-hand Bolshevik and a worthy successor of his boss's political genius. It was he who systematized the practices put in place by Lenin. These were essentially 4, the main 4. First, very important, Stalin understood that future revolutionary actions would be different from those used in 1917, 1922-23. Therefore, he conceived a unitary USSR communist power that would drive the huge international communist movement and that would bring socialism to the planet on the tip of bayonets. Second, to do this, he began by launching a plan of rapid industrialization while financing and feeding the workforce by collectivizing agriculture. Third, he was able to modernize the Red Army, which had defeated Germany in 1944-45 and overrun Central and Eastern Europe and has been stopped only by the presence of the American army in the West. From 1999 and right through the 50s, he actively aided the communist surge into the greater part of Asia, in China and Indochina especially. After he died, it's continued in Africa, in Latin America, and not forgetting in Western Europe, as in France and Italy, for instance. And 4, none of this could have been possible without the systematic application of mass terror, firstly in the USSR and later in other national communist parties. Depending on the place or the moment, this mass terror often went beyond crimes against humanity and orchestrated genocide, as in 1930-33, as with the Holodomor, famine in Ukraine, the extermination of elites in annexed territories in 1939-1941, for instance, in Poland, in Baltic states, in Bessarabia. In Poland, it's well known with the massacre of Katyn. And again, it's continued between, for instance, 1975 and 1979 in Cambodia under the Red Khmers, where in 3 years and a half, the Red Khmers killed 20 and 25% of all the population. The memory and history of these mass crimes were hidden and publicly denied and often ridiculed for decades. Both the terror used by national communist regimes as well as the threat posed by powerful political, military, and ideological force of the USSR and the world communist system against the free world, all that created a phenomenon of negationism, a denial of the reality and size of these crimes. Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, along with many others, were acclaimed as heroes by many, who also included a fraction of the intelligentsia and Western democratic voters. It was impossible for historians and researchers to access valid and uncontestable evidence of these crimes. The archives of the various communist regimes were firmly closed and made top secret to any outsider. The publication of Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, in 1974 did try to break the silence, but the effects of its contents were often countered by effective communist propaganda. It was only in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in 1991, with the collapse of the USSR, that this situation changed. Everyone was able to see for themselves to what extent the propaganda had masked the disastrous economic and social situation when this political intimidation by the communist parties disappeared. The regimes and their communist parties' archives began to be open to the public. This is what I called at this moment, when I began to go to Moscow in 92, 93, 94, I called that the documentary revolution. This documentary revolution was decisive to give access to researchers to documents of the highest quality and validity. From 1991 onwards, first, the victims of European communism have been able to make public the memory of their personal tragedy. And second, at the same time, historians began to write the history of crimes committed by the communist regimes. Memory and history began to walk in the same direction. Of course, this historical and memorial work was not plain sailing. While the communist regimes may have collapsed, many of their party leaders and nomenclatura were still in place, and especially the secret police, whose job was repression and terror. This battle for the truth has resulted in different outcomes depending on the various transitions from communism. Here are some examples. On those countries where there had been a true anti-communist revolution, as in the Baltic states, this battle was led directly by the new political leadership. For example, President Lennart Meri and the Prime Minister Matla in Estonia. In Estonia, when the Black Book was published in Estonia, at the beginning of the book was the introduction by the President of the Republic. And in the book was a chapter more by the Prime Minister, who was before an historian, and who gave a long chapter about the crimes of communism in Estonia. So it was an official action. In those countries where the dissident movement was strong, it was civil society that led the battle for truth. For instance, in Czechoslovakia, with Václav Havel, who opened the archives of the Communist Party and who applied the lustration laws. For instance, in Germany, the Gauck Commission took control of the Stasi archives and allowed every citizen of the ex-DDR access to their file, during which the lustration law were operational. In Poland, where the Solidarność movement was so strong, was put into place a huge history and memorial project, especially in connection with the Katyn massacre of Polish officers in 1940. On the other hand, in those countries where a dissident movement had been weak, the communists were able to easily hide behind their adherence to democratic principles, while at the same time blocking access to archives and intimidating ex-political prisoners. Here are some of this regime. For instance, in Romania, I am active in Romania, where the fight continues now. You had all this last month a strong fight between the President Băsescu, who recognized publicly in the parliament the crimes of communism in Romania, and the Prime Minister, who is a representative of the ex-nomenclatura and political police Securitate. Same thing in Albania, for instance, where the famous dissident Ismail Kadare is unable to express freely. In Ukraine, for instance, also, in Belarus, it is really very difficult to work on this question, and the archives are closed or not really open. And I don't give any mention of Cuba, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and all those other places where historical and memorial research is impossible or really dangerous. The last case is the involution or regression in Russia. While the archives and memorial work started well in Russia, in particular with the work of the famous dissident Vladimir Bukovsky and of the well-known association Memorial, Mr. Putin has done everything to stop this work. He has even begun a process of rehabilitation of Stalin. Despite all these difficulties, both historical and memorial work has made great progress over the last 20 years, with historians and citizens winning some great victories. One of the most significant of those victories was the publication of the Black Book of Communism on the 7th of November 1997. 7th of November, you understood, a symbolic date. Its appearance caused a wide debate across Europe and beyond. Today, the Black Book has been translated into 26 languages and has sold more than 1 million copies. The Icelandic edition is the 25th, and I was really surprised when I discovered it. And great thanks to Hannes for this translation. It was followed, the Icelandic edition was followed last year by the Georgian one. I think that the leader of Georgia wanted to give a signal to Mr. Putin. For the moment, there are no Chinese or Vietnamese editions of this book. The book's team was made up of 4 French historians who were specialists in Soviet, Asiatic, and international communism, as well as 2 Central and Eastern European historians. The first one of these later was the Czech Karel Bartoszek, a dissident and spokesperson for the Charter 77 group, a strong group of dissidents, where was President Havel. Great friend of Bartoszek was great friend also of Havel. He was expelled from Czechoslovakia in 1982 and today deceased. The second was Andrzej Paszkowski, Polish, a member of the Polish Academy of Science and of the Polono-Russian Historic Commission. Both of them knew what it was like to live under communist power. The world success of the book confirms the widespread public opinion that had been waiting for such a work to clearly expose the criminal dimension of communist regimes and their respective parties across the planet. Beyond the various descriptions of the principal criminal events of this regime, I highlighted in my introductory chapter the issue of comparison between the 2 great totalitarian regimes of world history, communism and Nazism. The legitimacy of this comparison was violently contested in France, in Germany, in Russia, etc. At the heart of this quarrel was the effective delegitimization of communism ideological claim to be humanist by placing the nature of totalitarian regimes to the forefront to the debate. The Black Book's publication had an effect on aspects of historical and memorial works on a number of fronts. Some of these were: it encouraged the increase in personal evidence giving about communist repression. Second, it speeded up the historiography about repression and terror. Third, the building of memorials to the terror as well as special museums. For example, the Stasi Museum in Berlin, the House of Terror in Budapest, the Memorial and Museum of the Holodomor of the famine in Kiev, the enormous memorial to the victims of communism in Sighet in Romania, etc., etc. And all these places are visited by large numbers of people and school children every year. 4, more and more archives, including police records of the political police, have been opened under pressure from historians. and 5 and late, there have been formal condemnations of communist crimes by governments. For example, the Ukrainian law that decrees the Holodomor as genocide. Another example, the official reports of communist crimes in Romania by the President of Republic Băsescu. And even recently, it was the 12th of July this year, the official condemnation of crimes of communism by the Parliament of Moldova, and even the interdiction for political use of the symbol of the communist, hammer and, in English, sickle, hammer and sickle. You can use it for historian work in a photography, historical photography, etc., but not for political use. Second battle after the Black Book, very important battle, the battle for truth in the Council of Europe. There was another key moment in the battle for truth on 25th January 2006 during the parliamentary meeting of the Council of Europe. The Swedish Eurodeputy Lindblad expressed his fear during a debate in 2003 that, citation, the wider public had very little knowledge of the crimes committed by the communist regimes. So, Lindblad proposed a white paper to the Council of Europe to pass a law condemning these crimes. This proposal was very moderate in detail because the Council does not have any legislative or judiciary or even executive power. Nevertheless, after some very violent debates led by communist deputies, in particular the Russian Zyuganov, or the neo-communist, or the post-communist, or even some socialists, the resolution was passed with only 99 votes, again against 42, with 12 abstentions. Deputy Lindblad also made, in the same session, a proposal to vote on a resolution insisting on the teaching of the history of communism in schools and the increase in the number of public memorials to its crimes. Incredibly, the resolution did not receive the two-thirds majority required for its adoption. Only 85 for, 50 against, and 11 abstention. The scandalous rejection of this resolution, as well as the fact that only two-thirds of the deputies of the Council of Europe voted for a resolution of moral condemnation of the crimes committed by the communist regimes, says a lot about the persisting influence of this totalitarian ideology and the networks that continue to defend it. Nevertheless, in September 2011, the European Parliament in Brussels held an exposition about the Siget Memorial. This exhibition, the first of its kind at European level, was opened by the President of the Parliament, the Polish Deputy Buzek. These battles for truth about the communist crimes are far from over. It is progressing also in the field of history. There has been a marked increase of works about the Gulag, even the Laogai Chinois, organized famines, etc. The fundamental question concerning totalitarianism is once again at the heart of the historiographical debate. For example, I shall give the recent work of our American colleague, Timothy Snyder, with his book Bloodlands, in which he maps and compares the great massacre of the masses by the communists and Nazis in Central and Eastern Europe during the 30s and until 53, but especially during the war from 39 to 45. Finally, there is another taboo question that needs to be addressed. This concerns Lenin. The famous secret report of Nikita Khrushchev in 1956 brilliantly succeeded to decouple the bad Stalin from the good Lenin. now this vision of an initial communism that is somehow good and democratic persists up until today. The archives, however, show that Lenin was the inventor of the system and that he experimented with it in all its details from 1917 to 1922-23. Stalin and his henchmen did little more than apply this system to a much greater scale and in a more systematic way. The next stage in this historiography is going to see the demystification of Lenin as an icon. We can do this by intensifying our research, its interpretation, and diffusing the information. I have just come back from Kiev last week in Ukraine, where with 1 month to go to election, the communist candidates are present on poster, kiosks with red flags, hammer and sickles throughout the city, as well as full-page advertisement in the press. I ask a question, who is paying for this? And in addition, in the center of Kiev, the statue, a huge statue of Lenin, is always in the center of the city, and the communists said that it is impossible to destroy it because it is an artistic, you understand, an artistic production. Even in France, after their very poor showing in the recent election of the last month, the most orthodox and negationist communist ideology continues to flow in the media and across internet and even in the university and in the research. This is why I would like to once more thank the organizers of this conference for drawing attention to this crucial question that concerns the future of all Europe. We must continue to fight without stint the situation imposed by the communists for decades now. This of an over-memorization of Nazi crimes and amnesia of the crimes of communism. We must move towards a unified history and memory of this terrible 20th century, taking into consideration the barbarity of the two great totalitarianism. Thank you.